What's up, Spider-Man fans? Today we are going to be ranking all of the live-action Spider-Man movies because, of course, we just got Spider-Man No Way Home, the biggest Spider-Man movie of all time. Spoiler alert, bringing together the three Spider-Man, crossing over these three franchises was such an amazing moment. And, of course, leading up to this film, I rewatched all of the previous live-action Spider-Man movies in preparation. So now that we have all 8 of these movies here, I figured what better to do than rank these, because of course everybody has their own opinions, and this video is just going to be my personal opinion and my personal rankings, so you can let me know your own rankings in the comments below. But I just wanted to share my ranking with you, and again, we can compare and just talk about our love of Spider-Man and these Spider-Man movies. Now, again, I want to note specifically that these are live-action Spider-Man movies, so that means I will not be including the Venom movies, mainly because I haven't even seen Venom Let There Be Carnage yet, so that'd be kind of unfair. And then also live-action, so I'm not going to be doing Into the Spider-Verse either, even though that is an amazing movie, but I just haven't seen it in the longest time, so I didn't have time to rewatch that before No Way Home, so that also kind of wouldn't be as fair either. So anyways, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, again, let me know your own rankings in the comments below. But let's jump into this at the bottom of the list. Again, we've got 8 films on this list. And we're actually starting off in an interesting point, because at the bottom of this list, ranked at number 8 and number 7, are actually 2 movies that I kind of went back and forth on. And originally, I couldn't officially decide which one was going to come in last place at number 8 and which one was going to be boosted up to number 7, because they both actually suffer from very similar problems. But after weighing the pros and cons of each film, actually just a couple minutes before this video, I completely switched it around, and like 5 minutes ago, it was the other way around. But I decided to switch it, and in number 8, I put Spider-Man 3. Now, based off that, you can probably already guess what number 7 is going to be, but we'll wait for the official reveal of that. But let's talk about Spider-Man 3. So this is at the bottom of a lot of people's lists, and for a number of reasons. And really the main reason is just because there's too much going on here. There's too many villains, specifically with Venom, who doesn't even need to be in the movie. And Sam Raimi, the director of the film, has mentioned that many, many times, that he didn't even want to do Venom. He wasn't like a super fan of the character. He just wanted this to be a nice Spider-Man story featuring Harry Osborn as the new Goblin and the Sandman. And Sandman was going to be the main villain, but instead we got Venom kind of shoehorned in here, which wasn't terrible. And honestly, I think Sam Raimi did the best he could do with what he was given to work with, but it just would have worked so much better if we didn't have Venom in here and they saved him for like possibly a 4th Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie. Because Venom really is my only, or at least my main big problem with this movie. Not only the fact that he was shoehorned in here, but also because the character just isn't really executed that well. Because sure, you've got little hints of it throughout the story, and of course you've got Bully Maguire, which at first, when I first watched the movie, I thought that was a terrible idea. Now, years later, that has become such a meme. It's still not something I would have done, but it's like so hilarious now, and like almost to the point of you just gotta make fun of it. But I do like the idea of what Sam Raimi was trying to do with it, though, with the fact of showing how the symbiote would change Peter. And I did like that idea. I just thought, there's a reason it's a meme now in so many ways. And then also, Eddie Brock himself, I feel like another big mistake here was just the casting of Topher Grace, because I'm a fan of Topher Grace. I love him in That 70s Show. I think he's a great actor, and he does a good job in this movie. Like, his acting isn't the problem here, it's just he's not fit for the role, because in this movie, during my rewatch last week, I kind of realized that this version of Eddie Brock is much more, at least in his mannerisms and the way he acts and also his voice, is more so like Carnage. Like when he was in Venom form and you just had like that high-pitched sadistic voice, it just reminded me a whole of a lot more of Carnage. So honestly, wouldn't have been a bad casting for Carnage, but instead this Venom, and Venom's supposed to be this big bulky character, which I love from the Tom Hardy Eddie Brock Venom, where how you've got this big hulking Venom, but this one was just like skinny Topher Grace, which it just didn't really fit in well with the story. And again, Venom was just kind of shoehorned into this movie. Now moving on to number 7 on the list, which again, I said suffers from a lot of the same problems, and that is The Amazing Spider-Man 2, because, again, there's just too much going on in this film. Too many villains. Electro is supposed to be the main villain, but then you've also got Dane DeHaan's Harry Osborn in here as the Green Goblin, and then also Paul Giamatti as the Rhino, and I really feel like all three of these villains are just over the top and almost like overacted, especially Paul Giamatti's Rhino. I mean, he's literally narrating everything he does and just acts super stupid. Like, I gotta be honest, at first I wasn't a huge fan of the design of Rhino and his whole mech suit. Over the years I've gotten used to it and I kind of like it now. But when it comes to Dane DeHaan's Harry Osborn, this is like, this was probably my biggest problem in this movie, was this character, because he's just automatically introduced in this movie and his storyline is just rushed so much, because like they have like one scene, like I think it was like 2 scenes between him and Peter, and they explain it as like, oh, they used to be best friends and everything, but it's basically the same storyline that they did with James Franco's Harry Osborn in the Raimi movies, except that had 3 movies to build up that storyline, and even though it wasn't executed perfectly, it still was a whole lot better than it was here, because this storyline was just rushed so much. And of course, you know, him being basically kind of the big bad, because after Electro's defeated, he's the one that actually ends up killing Gwen Stacy, and he's the one that has the big moment. But it just doesn't really work that well. And also, I wasn't a fan of his actual Green Goblin design. He just looks almost more like a troll. And another thing I wasn't a fan of in this movie is the whole storyline with Peter's parents, which was kind of set up a little bit in the first movie, the first Amazing Spider-Man movie, but is really focused on in this movie. Actually, the opening scene is dealing with his parents, which I thought was an interesting idea at first, because like you never really hear anything about Peter Parker's parents, but there's a reason for that, because it just feels so out of place in this movie. But you know, that's it for the cons. Let's talk about the pros for this movie, because obviously the biggest one is just Andrew Garfield is just an amazing actor, and he's just embodying Spider-Man and Peter Parker. We get some of the best live action Spider-Man swinging and action in this movie. And speaking of action, another amazing Spider-Man live-action fight scene with the Electro Times Square battle, which really was an amazing scene. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of Electro in this movie, that scene really was amazing. I love how Spider-Man, when he first gets there, he actually tries talking to Electro first, and of course, you know, things go wrong, and it's not even either one of their faults, it's part of the NYPD's fault, but I just thought that scene was executed so well. And of course, the ending of this movie with Gwen Stacy's death, even though it was super predictable and we all saw it coming, just like after seeing the chemistry and the relationship between Peter and Gwen throughout these first 2 movies, it just hits you so hard, and the way it's executed is so great. And then the ending, how even after her death, Andrew's Peter still decides that he's still going to go on to be Spider-Man, and then you got that ending with Rhino where I love how you have the little boy that's like dressing up as Spider-Man, and then Andrew's Peter returns, and yeah, it's great. But now we're moving on to number 6 on the list, which is going to be Spider-Man Far From Home, which before I did this rewatch, I never thought would be this low on the list, but now that I have rewatched it, it is, because this doesn't really feel like a Spider-Man movie. Sure, it is Spider-Man, but I mean, first of all, the whole movie takes place in Europe pretty much, and also it is more so like that MCU Iron Boy Jr. type cliche and stereotype that people keep calling Tom Holland's Peter Parker MCU character, which I've been a big defender of, but I gotta admit, in this movie with Edith and all that stuff, I'm not a big fan of it. And also, Peter's kind of stupid in this, literally giving the glasses to Mysterio. It just feels almost kind of lazy. But then again, speaking of Mysterio, he is the best part of this movie, and Mysterio is my favorite Spider-Man villain from the comics, so I loved seeing him in live action here, and I thought the character was done really well. I loved his design and how he made up this whole story about him being a hero from a different universe, and then also, of course, how he had like the mocap suit and all that stuff. I thought there was some really cool connections to the real world and like movie making and everything, and how he had his whole team. Jake Gyllenhaal's performance in this is just amazing, and Mysterio really is the best part of this film. But other than that, again, it has its problems, and that's why it's ranking so low on this list. Now moving on to number 5 on the ranking, which is going to be The Amazing Spider-Man from 2012, which again, like, I love doing these rewatches of these movies because it changes your perspective so much. Because I used to completely hate these Amazing Spider-Man movies, but after this rewatch, not only has Andrew Garfield become my favorite Spider-Man, but I've absolutely fallen in love with this movie of The Amazing Spider-Man. I absolutely love it because it does, of course, kind of a rehash of the origin of Peter Parker Spider-Man. And I do think it was better executed in the Tobey Maguire Raimi movies. But I do still enjoy seeing how it was executed in this film. And really one of the best things about that makes it so good, again, is Andrew Garfield's amazing acting ability, and especially his chemistry and his interactions with Uncle Ben of this universe. I love those scenes with that character, specifically when you had the scene in the high school where Peter just embarrassed Flash Thompson in front of the whole school, so then Uncle Ben had to come to school and, do all that stuff. And then how he sees Gwen in the hallway and he's teasing him like, oh, hey, you're on his computer. And I absolutely love that scene. And speaking of that, Gwen Stacy, Emma Stone, is one of my favorite parts of literally anything Spider-Man live action. She's my favorite live action Spider-Man love interest. Emma Stone is an amazing actress, and she's just so good in these movies. Just the chemistry between Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone. You can totally tell that they were actually dating in real life at the time of this movie, which, fun fact if you didn't already know that. But yeah, they were, and you can totally tell because just their chemistry is just out of this world in this movie, and I just absolutely love their relationship in this. And especially that scene where he reveals to her that he's Spider-Man. It's like so romantic, but also like, just cool. And like, I don't even know how to explain it. I just love it so much. And then of course we do have the Lizard as the villain of this movie, which again, I did really enjoy a lot more on this rewatch, but still not the biggest fan of the Lizard design and really his whole plan of just like, oh, I'm going to turn everybody into lizards. It didn't make that much sense, but still, I've grown to love this movie a whole lot more than I used to. Number 4 in this ranking is going to be Spider-Man from 2002, starring Tobey Maguire, because this movie is just pure Spider-Man. They managed to literally bring the comic book origin to life. This is pure Spider-Man. Core Spider-Man is literally a perfect adaptation of the Spider-Man story with his origin story, and just everything about this character is in this movie, and that's what I absolutely love. Again, it's such a well executed origin with the whole Uncle Ben thing, and with great power comes great responsibility. I just absolutely love it, and that's one of the things with this whole franchise of the Raimi movies is just the castings are so perfect for all these characters, and again, the chemistry, it's so good. Especially with Willem Dafoe here as Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, the main villain of this movie, who, I will admit, like, he kind of loses motivations halfway through the movie and goes from wanting to get revenge on, like, his company for kicking him out to all of a sudden just being like, oh, I gotta kill Spider-Man. He does lose his motivations, but still, he is an amazing villain in this movie and really puts Peter through some things. And, again, it's just the perfect core Spider-Man story out of all these movies. Alright guys, here we go, getting into the top 3 here. Number 3 is going to be SpiderMan Homecoming. This movie has such a soft spot in my heart. I absolutely love this film, and I know a lot of people don't because it is an MCU movie and because, oh, you've got Iron Man in there and it's the more techie side of Spider-Man, and that is one of the things I don't really like about the movie so much, is the leaning on Stark Tech and with Karen, which, I honestly do kind of miss Karen, but like just the fact of Spider-Man having an AI system in his suit and like having all that crazy tech stuff, I'm not a fan of that, but everything else about this movie I absolutely love, because this movie does what no other Spider-Man movie does, with showing us Peter in high school. Because sure, we do get like a couple scenes of Peter in high school in the Raimi movies and the Webb movies, but this whole movie takes place in high school, and I absolutely love that. Of course, I can really relate to that, actually being in high school myself, so just seeing those relationships and seeing Peter as a teenager and seeing his relationship with Ned and also him having a crush on Liz, and I absolutely love then having the homecoming dance. There are just some really cool elements to this movie, and of course it's not an origin movie. It's the first MCU Spider-Man movie, but it's not an origin. But at the same time, if you saw Spider-Man No Way Home, you know that it is kind of like part one of a 3-part origin for this MCU Spider-Man. But another thing I love about this movie is the villains. Like, for example, they do some great world building by literally just having cameo appearances of characters like Matt Gargan and Aaron Davis, setting up that those characters can in the future become Scorpion and Prowler, and even though we haven't seen that yet, I'm still excited for when it does. And of course, Michael Keaton as the Vulture, literally one of the best MCU villains of all time. Might even be my favorite Spider-Man villain in the movies. I gotta, maybe I'll do a ranking. We'll see on that. But he really is an amazing villain. Like, literally, he's just, like, it's not like he's got crazy superpowers or anything. He's just your everyday man. Again, a super relatable character. Michael Keaton's performance here is just astonishing. And the whole reveal with him being Liz's dad, even though that's not something in the comics, it makes so much sense in the story and just adds so many great elements. And just that whole car ride on the way to Homecoming, and just the scene where he realizes that Peter's Spider-Man is just so good and is one of the best parts about this movie. Again, this film really holds a soft spot in my heart, and it's just, I just love it so much. I really enjoy every time I rewatch Spider-Man Homecoming. But now we're getting into the final two here, where number 2 is going to be Spider-Man 2, which, of course, pre-No Way Home, which obviously, spoiler alert, is number 1, everybody was saying that Spider-Man 2 was the best Spider-Man movie of all time, aside from Into the Spider-Verse. But now No Way Home has outdone that, and I'll talk about that when we get to talking about number 1. But Spider-Man 2 is just the perfect Spider-Man story, because, you know, it takes what it did in the first movie, which is the great origin story for Spider-Man, and adds layers upon that, where you have now Peter. His life is better, but he's still trying to figure out things and try to learn how to balance his life, because he realized that he can't have everything that he wants in this life. So that's something I really enjoy, seeing that element featured in this film, and of course his kind of on and off again relationship with Mary Jane Watson in this movie. And that's a big thing that I really love about this franchise, is just their relationship, and like how you see just that roller coaster of their relationship and everything they go through together, especially with the ending there. And basically throughout the whole thing, like, he is in love with her, but due to the fact that he wants to protect her, he is using his great power and the great responsibility to keep her out of danger by not being with her, even though it's absolutely killing him inside. And by the end of it, she's like, you know, I can make my own choices, you know, all that stuff. It's great. Of course, we have Alfred Molina as Dr. Octopus, the main villain of this movie, and just such a great villain as well, because he's such a complex character, because he really is a good guy. It's just that, you know, he gets a little greedy there, and then, you know, his inhibitor chip gets fried, the tentacles take over, and he turns into this super evil guy. And of course he has that redemption at the end where he sacrifices himself, and he's just such a well executed villain in this movie. And you guessed it, number 1 is Spider-Man No Way Home. And sure, you could be saying this is just like recency bias, like I literally just watched this movie a couple days ago, but this really is, in my opinion, the best live action Spider-Man movie, because it does so much in this movie, specifically for Tom Holland's Peter Parker Spider-Man, really making him into the true Spider-Man, with, of course, spoiler alert if I didn't already say that before, the death of Aunt May, which of course is not something that happens in the comics, but they kind of use her death as the role of Uncle Ben in the MCU, with her being the one that tells him, with great power comes great responsibility. And throughout this film, Peter just has to go through this journey of really learning the consequences of what it's really like to be Spider-Man, and by the end of this film, making the ultimate sacrifice of literally having Doctor Strange cast a spell to make everyone forget that he was Spider-Man, or just completely forget that Peter Parker exists at all. So by the end of this, he is completely and utterly alone. But again, just like how with Andrew Garfield Spider-Man at the end of Amazing Spider-Man 2, he still gets up and goes out of there because he has that great power and that great responsibility that he now has to deal with. And I loved how now he's not dealing with his Stark tech suit or anything like that anymore. Now he sewed his own suit, which is just the classic look of Spider-Man from the comics. I'm so excited to see that suit return in the future. And it's just so good. And speaking of Spider-Man, we of course have the other Spider-Man in this movie as well, with Tobey and Andrew, and just their conversations and their relationships and interactions with Tom's Peter are just so good and so fulfilling and so satisfying to see in this film. And of course the return of all these villains, which really, that's what this movie is all about. It's kind of a love letter to Spider-Man movie fans. Whether you're a fan of the Tobey Maguire movies, of the Andrew Garfield movies, or the Tom Holland movies, this really brings us all together in really a metaphorical way, because like for years people have been fighting over like, oh, who's the best Spider-Man? But literally in this movie we have all three of these Spider-Men hugging and calling each other's brothers and saying they love each other, which is basically metaphorically saying like there doesn't have to be a best Spider-Man. They are all amazing Spider-Man in their own right, and that's really what this movie is all about. Again, it is just truly a love letter to fans of Spider-Man movies. And that's why it's at the top of my list. That's why I absolutely love this film, and I've only seen it once, but I am so excited to see this movie again. But guys, that is my official ranking of all 8 live-action Spider-Man movies. Again, let me know your own rankings in the comments below. Do you agree with my picks? Let me know your own picks. All that good stuff. But for now, guys, thanks so much for watching. Please drop a like if you enjoyed this video, and hit the subscribe button so I can keep you up to date on everything that goes on in the Marvel life.